having a bad day.
Hello? 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 Why doesn't he see me? Hello? Dr. Walhagen?
I
Dr.
can't.
Walhagen?
I can't hear you.
Hello? Oh, okay. Can you see me?
Yes.
Oh,
If I
okay.
couldn't
You know,
see you, I wouldn't know that you were.
okay, because I was like calling you. Okay. So you can't hear me?
I can't hear you.
Oh,
So I was told that you guys weren't going to be in class today
okay. They
because
said
of.
they told. Oh, well, Mr. Bachner, when I talked to him earlier today, he said that like we could either come to class or go to the diversity thing. So I didn't know that we had the option to that class wasn't happening today. Hello?
Hello?
Hey, Zach. um. Yeah. So I can't.
I don't know what to do.
Yeah, Alexander's having trouble with the audio.
Oh, is it working now?
No.
I can hear her.
It's funny because. Wait a minute. Do I have my computer audio muted?
Hello?
That's a possibility. No, wait a minute.
Can you guys hear me now?
Hold on.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Okay, there we go. My bad. The problem was on my end.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, that's fine. So, like, earlier today, Mr. Bachner, like, forgot that we had this, so he said we could go to either MSON or the class. And since
I see.
my brother's in the same diversity thing, I thought maybe he could just tell me what they did, and then
Okay.
I'd come here, so.
Okay. Good. That's fine with me. It makes it a little less awkward as a class. I was considering just canceling the class when I got that email, but I think because we don't have very many classes left, um, I think we better just go through Aristotle today, and Sam and Jacob can just watch the playback and get the slides. So Zach, I actually think, is it all right with you if we wait until Wednesday for you to do your presentation? We'll just do all four of you guys on Wednesday.
Okay.
Yeah. Just because I think with only Alexandra here, there's just not as much of a point in having you
That's fine.
present your stuff. So we'll just talk about Aristotle today, I think. Let me see here. Although one thing, so next week, unless I hear otherwise, there's only going to be class on Monday. Monday will be our final class. Because exam week starts for MSON on Tuesday. And my understanding was that even Monday was kind of an optional day, but just especially now that we've sort of, in a way, lost today, I think now it's especially important to have class Monday. If you guys want to have class on Wednesday as a kind of review session or something like that, we could. But yeah, I'm still kind of waiting to hear about this. The other thing that I wanted to mention is the final exam. So I had been saying that I would give you next week to do the final exam and that it would be due on Friday, May 8th. That's what had been on eCollege and on the schedule. But grades are not due until the 22nd of May. And so I'd actually be willing to give you guys the following week to do the exam. So that, and either, I could either have it due on Friday or even Sunday. So that would be either Friday the 15th or Sunday the 17th.
Yeah, that would
you
be really
guys?
helpful. I think that's a good idea because I'd be able to have more time to study for both MSON and for the AP exam, so it would be a better than
Right. So you guys are both taking some APs?
Yeah, I have
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's enough for me to think, okay, I'll do it the next week. Friday versus Sunday, do you have preferences there? Let me say this. I think I'll give you like the 5-day period during which you can work on it. So it's either going to be from Monday to Friday or Wednesday to Sunday.
I guess whatever works best. The Sunday is kind of nice because then I could just take all of Saturday morning to just do it straight than having to break it up over a couple of days. If it's
I agree.
Yeah, so having that weekend where you don't have class time interfering, it's better that way. Yeah. Okay. So ruled. We'll make it do Sunday the 17th. Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. Cool. All right then. Well, let's just jump into a discussion of Aristotle. I know that because of Zach's work on his project, he knows a bit about Aristotle. So hopefully we can just kind of share the responsibility of explaining Aristotle and talking about it. You raised an interesting question about it, Zach. Okay, just again, normative ethics, the attempt to give a theory of what constitutes the rightness or wrongness of an action. Utilitarianism, we've talked about Kantian or deontological theories at this point. And that just leaves the third of the big three, Aristotle's ethics, or it's sometimes called virtue ethics. I thought I would just quickly review Kant a little bit. Again, for Kant, unlike when you're trying to tell whether an action is right or wrong, you don't look at the consequences of the action. Rather, you look at the maxim or the principle or the rule that determines the action. And by that, it's important to distinguish merely acting in accordance with a rule versus acting from that rule. So, sometimes a person could sort of accidentally do something that, in every observable way looks like it's following a certain rule. But that person might not have any clue what that rule is, might not be doing it because of the rule, right? There's a difference between a system that behaves in a certain way. You can come up with rules that describe how it behaves, even if the system itself isn't following those rules. So to have moral value, you have to look at the maxim or the rule or the principle that a person is following, that is intentionally following when they perform some action. Okay. Every moral maxim is a categorical imperative, according to Kant, instead of a conditional imperative. That's not the word that's usually used. What's the word that's usually used? Not a categorical imperative, but a... Wow, I'm blanking here. Do either of you remember what it was from last time? It was just one slide, so it's not surprising if you don't. Wow. Conditional imperative is the right idea, but it's not what they're usually called. This is irritating me. It's not really important, but it's irritating me. Hypothetical imperative is another possibility. Hey,
wait, I need to get into this. Sorry, we're downstairs, doing the diversity thing. I'm sorry I'm missing this, but
Okay.
I get back.
My brother is in it, so I'm having him tell me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're in the same. I mean, there's only two Hispanics.
Hey, I'm part Hispanic. My family's from Argentina, but I'm in the States right now.
Oh, okay.
hypothetical imperative, is that it? Man, why am I... Yeah, maybe hypothetical imperative was the... That sounds wrong to me. Anyway, let's not worry about this. It's not worth the time. You get the point that some kinds of imperatives tell you, if you want to do this, then you should do that. Categorical imperatives just say you should behave this way. Okay. For an action to be moral, it has to, you look at the maxim in accord, you look at the maxim that determines the action, the maxim that the person is following when they act, then that maxim has to be categorical, has to be something of the form, you should do X, and it also must conform to the supreme moral law. The supreme maxim, or what's sometimes just called the categorical imperative, act only in a way that one could will that one's maxim should become a universal law, right? It has to be universalizable. And this was supposed to follow from reason, because part of the reason that Kant thought it did is that if your maxim, when you try to generalize it, ends up being inconsistent, right, ends up undermining itself, it can't be something that reason affirms, right? Reason doesn't affirm anything that's contradictory or inconsistent. Okay, so it's got to be universalizable. Reason has to, you have to be able to think that it's something that everyone could do in your circumstances. Otherwise, reason wouldn't stand behind it, as it were. So treat others justly, always be honest, don't cause unnecessary pain, seem to be universalizable. But of course, there are problems. Even looking at Kant's own, his 4 cases of suicide, lying or not really intending to keep a promise, developing your best capacities, helping others. Some of these looked like they were fairly plausible cases of universalizability. Others, it wasn't so clear. There were these other problems. It's not always obvious which maxim to generalize when you're considering a certain act. So there's a difference, right? So you tell a white lie. Well, what happened here? Is the maxim that you should have followed the maxim that you ought not to lie? Or is it that, well, you shouldn't lie unless lying will prevent a whole lot of harm and not very many people will know anyway? Right? If one maxim doesn't justify the act, the other does. So it's not always clear which maxim you're following. There also seem to be cases of things that are universalizable, but what pretty clearly are not moral. My example was kill only those people who are super duper annoying. And then there are things that don't universalize but do seem morally permissible, like go shopping on Sunday when everyone else is in church. And then there was this issue about what happens if you have maxims that seem to be inconsistent with one another in a particular case. So, there might be a tension between never tell a lie and do no harm, right? How do you resolve those kinds of circumstances? Okay. So, look, there are problems with Kant's theory, but I don't want to give the impression that there's nothing to be gained from Kant's work. I think there's a lot to be gained, actually. It's a kind of corrective to the utilitarian's pure focus on consequences. We saw there are a whole bunch of cases where just thinking about the consequences of an act lead to some uncomfortable conclusions. And so with Kant's view, there's really a place for considerations about justice, fairness, human dignity, and rights. And so in that sense, it seems like a nice kind of corrective to some of utilitarianism's faults. This idea of human beings as ends in themselves is, I think, important. And this idea that you should never use another person merely as a means to your end. There are many cases of things that we think are horrible acts in the history of the world that involve treating other people as though they're just means to an end, without treating them with a certain kind of dignity or respect. Yeah, Zach.
And treating someone as ends in themselves, that would imply that it's just treating them in a way that they gain something from their interaction with you?
Well, it's not so much that they have to gain something.
It's that they aren't hurt by it?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I want to say that either. It's that their desires are respected. It's that their interests are respected. So you can use someone as a means to an end. So, for instance, you hail a taxi driver and you tell a taxi driver that you want to get to a certain place. You're using the taxi driver as a means to an end. You want to get to another place in a reasonable amount of time. Okay. But you aren't using him merely as a means to an end because, after all, you provide compensation. It's this person's choice to, let's just assume, be a taxi driver, accepts that sometimes he's going to take strangers to a part of town that they don't know very well, that kind of stuff. Right. So in most of these cases, there won't be harm, but the fact that the person is providing you with something does not exclude the fact that their wishes, that their preferences, that their desires are not also being respected. I suppose a person could agree to do something that is going to result in some pain. That's why, right? That's the kind of reason I'm a little hesitant to say you can tell whether someone's been treated as an end in themselves and not merely as a means, simply by asking, have they been harmed here? Yeah. It is a little tricky. But the idea is that human beings have a certain kind of dignity and a certain kind of worth, and that is to be respected in your interactions with them. Okay. Okay. And sort of related to this, the idea of that we're all equal in respect of moral worth. Now, maybe there are some counterexamples to this, but by and large, you should assume that human beings are equally morally valuable. And as such, it can't really, if it's right for you to do something in a certain circumstance, it's got to be right for others to do that. And the opposite is right. The opposite is true as well. If it's wrong for you to do a certain act in a certain circumstance, then it's got to be wrong for others. Or I guess the way you want to think about it is if it's wrong for so and so to do something in such and such conditions, then it would be wrong for you to do that in those conditions. And I think that this is actually a kind of basis for the supreme maxim, right? This idea that you should be able to will that the maxim of your act be universal, right? The idea is that anyone should be able to follow that same rule in your circumstances, and that wouldn't change the moral standing of that act. And there seems to be something right about that, something important about that. And finally, the idea that moral thinking is a kind of distinctive kind of thought that involves this sort of disinterested evaluation of your goals, your ends, your aims. And it's not, moral thinking is not just like prudential thinking about how to satisfy your aims and your desires. I think there's something kind of deep and important about that idea. So, okay. So much for Kant. That's brief, but we've got to move on to Aristotle. So Aristotle's moral philosophy, as I've said a couple times, is often called virtue ethics as well, because it focuses on the development of the virtues, these qualities in people that are thought to be good qualities. And virtue ethics is all kind of about how do we know what virtues are, which character traits are virtues, how do you develop them, and so forth. What's the right mix to have? Sometimes Aristotle's theory is contrasted with the kinds of moral theories that we've been looking at because it's a theory of the good, a theory of the good life in particular, as opposed to a theory of right action. Aristotle was not directly interested in giving an account of how do you tell whether a particular action is right or wrong. He was more interested in this idea of development of the person and living a good life. I actually think there's a lot of wisdom in Aristotle, and Aristotle remains important to read as a kind of source of a lot of practical wisdom. If you haven't read the passage for today from Nicomachean Ethics, I do recommend that you read it. It's quite good. That said, I remember as an undergraduate student just slogging through Aristotle. I found it very boring, very hard to read, but stick through it, and there's a lot to be gained, I think. But back to this distinction between a theory of the right and a theory of the good. So utilitarianism, Kantian ethics attempts to provide principles that you can appeal to tell, whether a given action is right or wrong. And you can think of this as specifying our obligations to others. But, and this is a point that Sober makes in the reading that I recommended, these kinds of theories, while they help you in certain cases, it's hard to apply them to ordinary life and the ordinary kind of decisions that we have in many cases. So what's the best way to spend your spare time? Decisions about college, what your major is going to be, whether you should go to college, decisions about who to enter into a relationship with. These are the sorts of decisions that are important in your lives, but it's not really clear that Kantian ethics help you make these decisions, nor is it very clear that utilitarianism does, although arguably utilitarian thinking can do a little bit better in some of these cases. But Aristotle was more interested in these kinds of, as it were, ordinary circumstances, and wanted to provide a kind of practical guide to how to live one's life. Aristotle, you guys probably have a sense of this already, but he lived about I actually think these dates are we have these dates pretty firmly set, 384 to 322 BC. It really is, I could go on and on about how important Aristotle was in the history of Western thought. And it really, but it's hard to exaggerate how important he was as a thinker. For well over 1,000 years, he was simply referred to as the philosopher. Much of medieval philosophy and medieval thinking was an attempt to square sort of religious beliefs with the teachings of the philosopher, and that was Aristotle. So one of the greatest of the medieval thinkers, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the reasons he was so great is that he did a lot of work to try to make Christian theology compatible with Aristotle's conception of the world and knowledge. The Ptolemaic model of the solar system, right? The geocentric model with the Earth at the center, and this system of spheres going around the Earth was developed in a pretty sophisticated way by Aristotle. He wasn't the first to propose it, of course, but he did develop a very sophisticated model of it that Ptolemy kind of made even better. His general physics was the physics up until 1600 or so, when Descartes finally overturned it. He wrote about everything. It's sometimes said that Aristotle is the last human being who basically knew everything there was to know about every subject there was to have knowledge in. Because after Aristotle, we started to gain much more knowledge, and so no one person could have knowledge in every field. But it's sometimes said that Aristotle did. Whether that's true, hard to know. Impressive figure, no question about it. And we don't even have his original works. What we actually have are mostly notes that people took listening to his lectures. Anyway, Aristotle's pretty cool. Okay, so yeah, I've already said this. Aristotle is interested in giving an account of the good life, a life worth living. That's an important way to think about what a good life is, a life that is worth living. And so I thought I'd maybe just turn it over to you guys a little bit here and just maybe share your thoughts on what you think a good life would be. And is there just one good life, or are there many good lives to be had? And what are some qualities of a life well lived? You guys have thoughts about this? Yeah, Zach.
Well, I think for each person there are multiple paths their lives could take to still be considered good lives, but I think so long as they are happy I think if they accomplish at least something of importance to themselves, then that would be considered a good life, as long as they don't hurt other people in the process.
Yeah, no, those are good thoughts. Alexandra, do you have any?
Yeah, I think as long as a person achieves like some sort of like personal happiness or achieve some sort of goal while living morally, and then using the definitions of morality from Aristotle and stuff like that, then I think they've lived a good life because they've like achieved their goal, they're happy, but they didn't, like Zach said, hurt anybody in the way. So.
Yeah, well, these are very good Aristotelian answers to this question, right? So both of you mentioned happiness, and yeah, we'll get to that in a second. And of course, Aristotle mentions happiness as well. In fact, Aristotle sort of identifies happiness, at least we need to understand what he means by happiness. But yeah, happiness is the ultimate end in life, and hence, and we can explain what that is in just a second. And so that is a good life. A good life is one that leads to happiness. But I think the provisos you both made are important, right? As long as it's not really harming others. Now, Aristotle has this account where someone who harms others can't really be happy. But, we could talk about whether we think that's plausible. But also this idea of accomplishing something that you both mentioned is an important aspect of happiness for Aristotle. He gets at the highest good, the end, what we're all striving for in life, by distinguishing instrumental goods from non-instrumental goods. So this is a little bit like the hypothetical versus categorical imperative stuff. And we touched upon this a little bit in our discussion of utilitarianism as well. There's some things that we desire simply as a means to something else. Arguably, money for most people is good only because it allows you to acquire other things. And then you ask, well, why do you want to acquire those other things? Well, sometimes it's because it'll allow you to achieve yet other things. Okay, but why do you want to do that? At some point, the thought was, Aristotle thinks that at some point, this question of, well, why do you want that? Why do you desire that? Why should you strive for that? Comes to an end in something for which that question no longer has any, you no longer feel any need to answer it. It's something that is desirable. It's something that one ought to seek in and of itself, simply for itself. And that will be the highest good. That will be a non-instrumental good. Aristotle's aware that there could be multiple different ends in themselves, ends that you strive for, things that you seek simply for themselves, but that there will be a most complete one. I think this is partly a result of a kind of commitment to the world's being kind of rationally structured, and there's something rational about the idea that there is one most complete ultimate good, or ultimate end. It's that which is sought for its own sake and not anything else. And as you guys have mentioned, this is happiness. Although this is an English word, right? That Aristotle doesn't ever use the word happiness. He spoke of this thing, eudaimonia. And it is often that word eudaimonia is often translated with the English word happiness, but that's really, you have to be careful with that word, because there are many senses of happy that would not count as eudaimonia according to Aristotle. So it's really the idea of a good state. You see, you there is a that root roughly means good. So good being, well-being, or flourishing, I think is a nice word. Happiness is flourishing. And flourishing involves certain things for different kinds of creatures. It involves activity. So both of you said there's something you need to accomplish in your life that's important to you, right? And that's the idea of striving, of activity. I know Jacob at least raised the question about the relationship between Aristotle's conception of happiness and Mill's conception of happiness. And there's something similar here, right? Both of them both of them distinguish the mere feeling of pleasure from happiness as such. Aristotle certainly does. I think in a way Aristotle has an even richer conception than Mill, but happiness is more than just a feeling. It's not even the belief that you're happy. He thinks that both of these things follow from true happiness, but happiness itself is something else. Yeah, Zach.
Was it Aristotle or Socrates that Mill references?
Oh, well, Mill he says that I'm sure he references both of them at some point, but he uses the example, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a satisfied pig or whatever, or a fool satisfied. Yeah, that's Socrates. Okay, so happiness is a kind of activity, and to know what activity, you have to know Aristotle thought, and this fits in with Aristotle's whole approach to things. Everything has a function. Everything has its proper end. And in order to know, right, so happiness is a kind of activity, a kind of a proper functioning. It's doing what you're supposed to do, in a way. And so to know what happiness or flourishing is for a human being, he thought you got to know what the function of human beings was. And so he uses the example of tools, or he uses the example of artisans or craftsmen or jobs of a certain kind. And he says, look, in each case, there's a kind of goal, there's a purpose. Tools are designed for accomplishing something. A hammer is designed to drive nails into hard surfaces. So a good hammer, a hammer that's doing well, is something that accomplishes, that does that function well, right? It's really good at driving nails. It has a good, kind of real solid anvil part. It has a nice balance to it, and doesn't have too small a head, so you can hit the nail well. And anyway, all these different characteristics that a good hammer will have that allow it to perform its function well. Likewise, a good heart. A good heart is one that accomplishes the function of the heart well. It pumps blood in a regular manner. It has it doesn't beat too fast or too slow, circulates blood to all the organs well, and so forth. Right? It's important to remember that a function is not just what a thing happens to do. A watch might happen to keep your wrist warm. That's kind of implausible, but it might go backwards. It might do all kinds of things, but that's not what a watch is supposed to do. It's supposed to work in a way that's appropriate to allow you to tell time. And a good watch is one that does that. Okay, so the idea that human beings have a function, it might seem like a funny idea nowadays. This is not, I don't know if this is something that we really tend to think about anymore, but I guess what I want to ask you guys is, do you think it makes sense to think that human beings might have a function? And if so, what might it be? And of course, the other question is, what do you think Aristotle's answer to this question is? Yeah, Alexandra.
Maybe the function would be to bring happiness to ourselves and others.
Now, are you saying are you suggesting that on Aristotle's behalf, or are you sort of suggesting that as an idea that maybe we would take seriously today? Which are you?
Yeah, I think the idea of both, Aristotle and nowadays. I think because I feel like what really defines our purpose is like what we accomplish, and like when you measure what you accomplish, usually it's like what makes you happy and like an impact that it's had, no matter like the scale, but it's done something for others. Like it's made some sort of impact to help others, and I think that's because the other function would be that you don't help others and you're not helping anybody, and that's not it. So I guess the function would be that you're helping others directly or indirectly, even by not doing anything. Like even if you're, let's say, not doing anything bad, you're just being a good, like a decent person in your home, and you're just like planting a garden. You're still doing something for others because you're not like robbing banks or something like that. You're keeping things calm. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's not Aristotle's answer, but.
Oh, okay. Well, okay.
That's all right. It's still an interesting thought. Although the one thing that Aristotle would not do that I think you did there is. Oh, sorry, Zach, did you want to respond to this, or were you going to offer a different account?
I agree with you that that's our purpose, like that we would agree with in modern times, but I had a different account of what I think Aristotle believes in.
Okay, so I'll go back to you in a second then, Zach. I just want to comment. So one of the things is that you argue that that's our function partly by saying that is something that brings happiness.
I think I was like trying to tie it back to the happiness central idea, but I don't know how well I actually did that. So.
Well, I guess what I wanted to say is that for Aristotle, there is going to be a connection between performing your function and flourishing and happiness in his sense. But he doesn't really try to define the function as, well, what do we do that brings happiness? He wants to give an account of the function of a thing in terms of its sort of characteristic activity, right? What it characteristically does, and in particular, what it does that distinguishes it from other things. And I mean, the suggestion you made that helping others might be that is interesting. I don't know. I'm trying to think if there are other examples in the animal life of, in the animal world of similar sorts of things. Like social animals help one another, right? Maybe not quite in the same way we do. But Aristotle would have wanted to ground flourishing, ground our function, account of our function in something that's very distinctively human.
Or I would say that ants, in a way, the function of their life is to contribute to the colony, which is a greater society, I guess, which is kind of like helping other people, although I think it's a bit more meaningful the way we do it. But I'm a human, not an ant, so I'm biased.
Right. But I mean, that's a good example of something from the animal world where there's a social structure, and it's only going to succeed if different individuals within that structure perform different roles, right? And I think in chimpanzee and ape colonies, whale like pods or groups, there's a kind of social structure there, a kind of division of labor. So still, it's an interesting suggestion. Yeah, Zach, did you want to suggest something on Aristotle's behalf?
So I thought from the reading he believed our function was to pursue intellectual and moral perfection, and we obtain moral perfection by following his idea of the doctrine of the mean and like finding these characteristics and virtues and sitting in the middle. And intellectual perfection came from taking our natural talents and trying to pursue them further. So whatever we're naturally good at, that is our function.
Yeah, so he did recognize this kind of individual variation in what people are naturally good at, and he did think that you should pursue your natural gifts and develop them. That was an important part of living a good life. The interesting thing about Aristotle is that he did want to identify a single thing, and although it wasn't super obvious in our reading, it's actually the use of reason. So the contemplative life, the use of reason to understand the world, to understand, and the world broadly construed. It's not just doing science. It would also involve art and philosophy. But the life of the mind, the life of reason, actually is what Aristotle thought was the ultimate, the highest end, because that's the thing that really distinguishes human beings, he thought, from all other forms of life, is the capacity to reason, to understand. Okay, so it's the attempt to use that capacity, understanding, reasoning well, that constitutes a good life. And performing well means with excellence or virtue. Virtue is almost a word for excellence. So now we get to the virtues and the rule of the mean, which is a very interesting idea. Just before we get to that, what are some examples of virtues? Some standard examples of virtues in people?
Honesty, courage, compassion, intelligence.
Yeah, intelligence is an interesting one to think about in terms of his view.
I guess it'd be more like the practical wisdom aspect of it.
Right. Yeah, but honesty, courage, kindness, right? Yeah, these are examples of virtues. Now, he has this very interesting idea that every virtue lies on this continuum between two vices. And every virtue is neither an excess nor a deficiency of something, but rather it's virtues seek the middle on these continuums. And so there are definitely examples that seem compelling regarding in support of this claim, right? Courage really does seem like a kind of intermediate between recklessness, and cowardice, right? So you imagine, different. It's easy to imagine soldiers going to war and different reactions to war, right? You have your people who are cowards who flee from the fight at the sight of the first sword or whatever. Then you've got your reckless person who just wades into battle regardless of the odds, regardless of potential of harm, without care, clearly going too far. You're like, that guy's just going to get himself killed. And then there's the courageous. It strikes a balance, right? Doesn't run from a fight, but also knows that this is not my battle. I have no chance of winning this. I'm not going to go forward here. Interesting to think about these three cases in connection with Frankfurt's old example of the Joneses, the three Joneses. You had the coward, the reckless, and the, maybe you'd say courageous, but anyway. Right, being good-tempered lies between irascibility and total imperturbability. Like, both extremes we tend to think are a little, we tend to think of them as character flaws, right? Whereas being good-tempered seems to lie between those extremes. Now, one question that's always worth asking. So, look, this idea that virtues are kind of means between extremes is plausible in many cases. But what you want to try to do is think about, well, what is the continuum along which we have an extreme, an excess, a deficiency, and a middle ground here? With courage, what is it? Yeah, Zach.
Well, I believe he notes that the continuum, the preferred virtue, the perfect amount of one or the other, isn't in the direct middle, but that it can vary depending on the type of virtue, etc. And I believe he noted that, well, he technically didn't say whether courage was closer to recklessness or cowardice, but he said that we, in general, prefer recklessness more than cowardice, which I think indicates that courage is closer to recklessness, but that doesn't technically mean it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's an interesting point that he makes that some of the extremes seem to be more contrary to the mean. Right, right. So I guess my take on this is that courage involves that the thing is the strength of your fear reaction to a situation, right? Combined with the degree to which you allow your fear reaction to control what you do, right? So you've got a kind of a gradation in both of these things, right? There's someone who feels no fear, and then there's people who feel more or less fear. But then you have to add to that how you react to a certain level of fear. And the courageous person, I think, it's these are the things that vary. And courage is somehow in between the extremes. Like the courageous person feels some fear, but doesn't allow that to prevent them from acting. Whereas the coward feels fear and lets that totally prevent action. Okay. Likewise with being good-tempered. This has something to do with the strength of your reaction to what? It's a little hard to say exactly what. Irritations, things that happen that are not in accord with your desires, maybe. A little tough to give a full account of what exactly is going on here, but something about things that aren't in accord with your desires, how strong your feeling is. There's very often a feeling that's occurring, and it has something to, and that feeling can take, uh, can occur in a small degree or to a great degree. So there you've got a continuum, and then you've got the way in which you react to that degree of that feeling, and virtues strike a kind of middle ground on both of these continuums continua. Okay, so Zach, you mentioned that there's something important about the use of practical wisdom in being happy, and so we've talked about virtues, the doctrine of the mean. The virtuous person acts virtuously, but what's the role? Aristotle thinks it's very important that reason is involved here, right? The best life is a life of reason. There is theoretical reason and there's practical reason. Practical reason has to do with action, and it has to do with the virtues. Is this something that came through in the reading to you? Do you have a sense of what do you think the role of practical reasoning is in virtuous action? Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
Having the intelligence to know what the mean is.
Yeah. Practical wisdom is very much about being able to spot the mean and being able to act in accord with that. The wise person is the person who is able to identify the mean, but also who is able to act on that knowledge. And that, I mean, I think that's kind of a nice idea about what practical reason is, practical wisdom is. Wisdom isn't just intelligence, right? Wisdom has a practical side to it. The wise man doesn't just know a lot of facts about the world. The wise man sort of knows how to act in different circumstances, sort of knows what's relevant, what's important in a given case. Yeah. And so you can't be happy, you can't flourish if you don't have practical wisdom, because you won't know the right thing to do in certain circumstances, and that's connecting with developing your capacities and acting well. Okay, I've already said that. Aristotle, the best life is contemplation. Best use of our capacity. He also, there's this idea that it's the most self-sufficient activity. You don't really have to rely on others in order to live the contemplative life. And he also thought that philosophers were the happiest people. I don't know what he would say if he were alive today about that. Of course, philosopher meant something a little different at the time. So, right, and this is in the sober reading. So if you didn't read the sobers paper, you wouldn't have got this. But there's this idea that there's a range of complexity of tasks, and the intellect is most active when you're doing complex things, complex intellectual tasks, and that you are happiest. He thinks this is an empirical claim. You're happiest when you're performing these complex tasks, and that was kind of evidence that the life of rational investigation, contemplation was the best life. Now, connecting this back to right action, Aristotle's answer to what the right thing to do in a given circumstance is you might think not very informative, but his account of virtues and how it is that you spot what virtues are kind of gives it some more content. But Aristotle's answer to what's the right thing to do in a given circumstance is, well, what would the virtuous man do? What would the virtuous person do in that? What does the good human do in this circumstance? And like I said, well, that just raises the question, okay, but how do I know what the good person would do? How do I know what the virtuous person would do? Well, that involves developing your skills, developing your practical wisdom. Very hard to provide general rules. This is an aspect of virtue ethics. Virtue ethicists almost never give general rules for right action because they think that perceiving the thing to do is highly contextual and it involves development of moral perception. Virtue ethicists often talk about moral perception. And the person who is practically wise is just able to perceive in a complex situation the right way, the way that someone who's very good at driving can get into a circumstance that they're not really been in before and still perceive the right way to handle the car. Skilled activity is hard to describe in terms of a bunch of rules. It involves this kind of sensitivity to the perception of the right way in a given moment. That's sort of what it is for you to be an expert at something, have expertise. And that's kind of an interesting idea, that there's a moral skill that can be trained. Now, Aristotle thought that training and upbringing was very important and that you had to train yourself in order to be a good person, to have, to be virtuous. So, Zach, you had a very interesting thought experiment in your journal. Do you want to quickly share that? It's your third. I think it was your third question. Yeah.
Was it the one about the man who's really good at math but hates math?
Oh, no. That's a different kind of issue, and that's interesting too. No, it's the one about, suppose a person lives their whole life.
Oh, yes, I remember. So the idea was, if a person lives their entire life doing exactly what a moral person does, so they're seen to be one of the most moral people in the world, they seem like a very good person, but the motivations for this is solely because they are thinking about what other people think of them. So they're only acting morally because they believe it's necessary for them to function in society. They're not doing it because the specific virtues involved with the actions, because it's the moral thing to do. My question was, would Aristotle consider this to be a just or moral person? And my understanding was that he wouldn't, which I think is interesting and kind of detracts from the credibility of the argument, because I don't think it sits as well with us.
Yeah, so this is a good thought experiment. I think that you're right that Aristotle would say if this person really didn't act out of perceiving the virtuous thing, but only because of sort of attempt to conform to norms or something like that, that person would not be a virtuous person. But he also would think that, so developing the virtues is developing a habit. And it's by repeatedly doing something that is the right thing to do that you become virtuous. And so he would actually think that it would be humanly impossible to be this person because just the act of repeatedly doing the right thing would build into you the virtue, and you would start to do it from virtue. Now, we could get into the debate, well, okay, maybe that's in fact true, but suppose it wasn't. Then I think maybe you have an interesting objection, but Aristotle's actual view is that that would not be humanly possible. That person would become trained to be virtuous. So. Now, the other objection is also interesting about a person who has this ability, and hence you would think you want to develop it, but just doesn't care about this ability. It bothers her that she has this ability, and she just doesn't get any pleasure from it. Yeah, I think that Aristotle's going to say if it's really true that you don't get pleasure from it, that it's not worth developing. Well, pleasure is a little bit not quite the right word. On the other hand, I think Aristotle thought that if you were really good at something, you couldn't help but get a kind of satisfaction from developing that ability. And again, we have to ask whether that's realistic, right? If that isn't really true, well, then there's a kind of problem with the view, with Aristotle's view. So, okay, we're pretty much out of time. Just real quick, some common problems, objections to Aristotle's theory. There's the thumb screw objection, which Sober kind of develops. It's the idea that, look, just because something is good at accomplishing an end, right? Just because something is a good X doesn't mean that it's good for it to be, good for it to exist, that X's are good, right? There's a good thumb screw, right? A good thumb screw is one that brings about excruciating pain when applied to a person's thumbs. Okay, so we can talk about what it is to have a good thumb screw, but that's not the same as it's being good that there are thumb screws, or that thumb screws are good things. And so some people say, look, just because we can say what it would be to live a good life, a life that accords with the function of human beings, it doesn't follow that it's good to live that way. See that? Yeah, that's a common objection. I have to admit, I'm not actually that convinced that I think it's a great objection. But there's also this question of whether we can really talk about functions of human beings anymore. There's a question about whether we can really identify all the same virtues that Aristotle thought we had. And then there's this problem I raised before about how do you know what to do? Because Aristotle says the right action is the action performed by the virtuous person. But how do we know what that is? Okay, maybe I'll comment on some of the things I think are really nice about Aristotle's theory another time. And so we'll wrap things up here for today. So next time, all final project presentations, no new reading or journal entries. All right? You guys are done with the reading for this course, so congratulations. Okay, so yeah, I look forward to hearing about what you guys have been working on next time. And yeah, I'll see you Wednesday. All right, cool. See you guys.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye, Alexandra.
Bye-bye.